Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming to this webinar today. My name is Will Snell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairness Foundation, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's event in partnership with the Policy Institute at King's College London as part of our Fair Society event series. And previous events in this series have included leading thinkers such as former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, the authors of The Spirit Level, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, the health inequalities experts Sir Michael Marmot, and the former LSE director Minouche Shafiq. And I'm delighted today to welcome Ingrid Robeyns to talk about her fascinating book, Limitarianism, the Case Against Extreme Wealth. This talks about the moral and the political perspectives, as well as economic, social, environmental, and psychological dimensions of wealth inequality, and argues that extreme wealth is not only unjustifiable, but also detrimental to society as a whole, and proposes a radical solution of placing a hard limit on the wealth that any one person can accumulate. And it seems that in the UK at the moment, certainly the debate about wealth equality is finally enjoying some long overdue attention, with the publication, for example, of Liam Burns' book on the topic in recent months, as well as a range of other interventions. And polling by the Policy Institute and the APPG for Inclusive Growth last year found that the UK public now think the very wealthy have more power and influence than government. The Fairness Foundation, in fact, excuse the shameless plug, will be publishing a wealth gap risk register this summer, looking at the ways in which wealth inequality damages our society, economy, and democracy, and what we can do about it. So after hearing from Ingrid for about 20 minutes, we'll have responses from a brilliant panel, firstly from Luke Hildyard, director of the High Pay Centre and author of the book Enough, Why It's Time to Abolish the Super Rich, which was published very recently, and then from Graham Hobson, technologist and member of Patriotic Millionaires UK. And we will aim to finish with plenty of time for Q&A before we wind up at 2 p.m. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. The sooner the better, and you can also upvote other people's questions. I'm going to hand over to Ingrid now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for inviting me. Will, if you could share my PowerPoint, then I will start the presentation. So the argument I'm developing in the book is, as Will introduced, that there should be, just like we have a poverty line where we want nobody to fall below, we should have a richest line or an upper limit to how much personal wealth a person can have. So the focus of my argument is both on the concentration of wealth as well as the distribution of wealth. So let's, if we can go to the next slide, let's then start by just looking at some basic data on wealth inequality and wealth concentration. Next slide. Thank you. All right, I have a question for everybody here in this virtual room. How do you think the total wealth distribution looks like in Europe? And I have ordered it from the top to those who have most to those who have least. And in the next slide, I will give you the numbers. But basically, I want you all to write down what you think that distribution is. So we often talk about the top 1%. Of course, if the distribution were exactly equal, the top 1% would have 1%, top 5% would have 5% of all wealth, top 10% would have 10%, next 10% would have 10%. The next 30%, and then we're like in the middle classes would have 30%, and the bottom 50% would have 50%. I've taken the data from the 2023 Global Wealth Report, which is most likely an underestimate of inequality because, as we know, some of the richest have certain strategies to keep their wealth out of view. But let's look at the numbers. These are the numbers. Actually, let's start at the bottom. The bottom 50%, so that's half of the population, has 1.6% of all wealth. I am actually not sure whether the concentration of wealth at the top is the most disturbing or the fact that half of the population has virtually no wealth. Of course, there can be cases where we might not be so so drastically concerned, say somebody who just left the family's house, a young person, 17, 18 years old, they're just leaving the house, the chances that they do not really have a lot of savings is substantive. But of course, they are not 50% of the population. Among that, 50% are also households from all age categories. We see the next 30% have almost 16% of wealth. The next 10% has slightly more than their share, has 15.9%. And we see that the concentration of wealth is really in the top 10%. The top 10% together has 66.7% of all wealth. And then we see further concentration. The top 5% has slightly more than half. And the top 10%, that is 1 out of every 100 citizens, has almost 30% of wealth. Next slide, please. So that was the distribution. Then what about the concentration? Well, there is this thing called the real-time billionaires list from the Forbes magazine. Here you see, this was a screenshot from a couple of days ago, but we see that Bernard Arnault, who is from the luxury goods empire, from Louis Vuitton and other brands, has almost 235 billion dollars. Now, I'm not going to do it because I'm likely to make a mistake, but I would invite you to try to calculate how many, houses of worth $1 million his fortune would be. This just gives us a sense of how huge these fortunes are. Because if we say, okay, Arnault has $234 billion, and at this point Elon Musk had 194, what are those numbers? Our brains are unable to process those numbers, so we must translate them to something that is that gives us a sense of the magnitude of those amounts of wealth, and these are really strikingly large numbers. So then let's move to what I see as the core of my book. Next slide, please. And that is, why should we care? So I just gave you those numbers to kind of situate the arguments and try to illustrate why I think we should look at those things. But the book that I wrote is really about the reasons why we should limit inequality by lowering the top levels. Each of those 6 reasons I have here on the handout is a full chapter in the book, so I will have to be brief in my presentation, and I will basically focus on 1 or 2, but we can discuss them at more length in the Q&A. The first one is that many of those fortunes are in some sense dirty, and of course you can think of the most striking examples, like fortunes that have traces to the transatlantic slavery. Those are cases where our moral intuitions are all okay. Yes, one shouldn't have fortunes that are stained in blood or in slavery. But throughout that chapter, I move from the clear cases like slavery and Nazi legacy to, say, exploitation of workers in the global south, to cases that are increasingly coming closer to our lives. And the last one I discuss is the line between tax evasion and tax avoidance. We know that tax evasion is illegal and tax avoidance is legal. It's making use of the facilities in the tax code to try to reduce or minimize your tax contribution. But what we've seen from the scholars who've documented how that line between tax evasion and tax avoidance has shifted, we see that line has actually shifted deliberately under the lobbying efforts of some very rich people. In the case of the US, there's an interesting book written by the founder and the current president of the American Patriotic Millionaires. It's called Tax the Rich. And they document layer after layer how the super rich, and often these are also people who are in companies, have lobbied to change the tax law and the fiscal rules so that they had to pay fewer taxes and that there were more loopholes. So this means that the line between tax evasion and tax avoidance, which our politicians often use as a reason why they can't do anything because some forms of, say, very low profits are reducible to tax avoidance, that line actually is also something that we as societies have facilitated to shift. So that is one important reason. The next one is, and that is the most, I think, philosophically fundamental reason, is that so much of our material success in life is due to luck. And there are three forms of luck that are relevant. One is natural luck, the natural lottery. So how are our genes?
I think Ingrid's experiencing bad luck on her connection at the moment.
I think that's right. I'm going to give her about 10 seconds to come back. But Luke, if you can stand by. Here we go.
There we go.
We lost you, Ingrid, for about 20 seconds.
I'm so sorry. We tried to plug in a cable to avoid that, but still, yeah, anyway, let me just, yeah. So the second argument really has to do with the fact that one can say that one deserves, for example, if one works 40 hours a week rather than 20, one can say that one deserves more. But I think that the reasons why people who have large fortunes are able to accumulate those fortunes cannot be translated by just looking at aspects of moral deservingness. And that is because luck plays such an important role. I was just explaining the role of natural luck, the natural lottery, so talents and so forth, but also how able one is to really put in a lot of effort. The energy levels that people have are also quite differently distributed. There's social luck. The parents one has had actually play a big role in our chances in life. And then there's such a thing as market luck. So we know that many products that sell a lot profit from being the dominant product on a market, and there is really an effect of luck involved in deciding which product becomes a dominant one and which doesn't. If one has that view on human nature and that view on what determines to a large extent whether we are able to be materially very successful, then it really makes it possible to justify inequalities to some extent, but it does not make it possible to justify a huge wealth concentration. So that's the second argument. The third argument is a more pragmatic argument, widely endorsed, I think, by economists, which says that, at least for redistribution, not necessarily for limitarianism, which says that the marginal value or marginal utility of money goes down. That means the more one has, the lower the additional benefit that a unit of money can bring. So, for example, if you are relatively poor and you get a few £100 a month extra, then that really makes a difference to the quality of your life and of your children. But if you have a very large fortune or an income of multiple £100,000, then really having another couple £100 really doesn't make a difference. And that means that if we were to have a situation where the distribution of money would be less unequal, overall welfare would be higher, welfare, well-being, and so forth. The fourth element is, I think, especially important in the US, perhaps also in the UK. I'll leave that to the other panelists to decide and discuss. And that is that wealth concentration undermines democratic values, in particular political equality. So we see that wealth holders can change their privileged position in the financial sphere into that power that they have into power in the political sphere by sponsoring political candidates and political parties, by hiring lobbyists who will then advocate for their policies, as we saw in the case of changing the tax code. and by influencing the public sphere, for example, by buying up media. Here we see a difference between how this plays out in different countries, because, for example, in continental Europe, we have quite strict legislation in many countries that there are hard limits to how much you can give in terms of political donations. In my own country, in the Netherlands, actually, this was lowered after some concerns in recent years that some wealth holders influenced the development of legislation regarding inheritance taxation. And now there is a cap of 100,000 euros per person per year. Of course, people try to find ways around. They let their children donate money and stuff like that. But it is at least an attempt to make walls between the sphere of money and the sphere of politics. But those walls will never be enough because of the loopholes, but also because some of those things are you cannot protect. You can protect donations, or at least the influence of donations. But for example, you cannot protect, lobbying. You could forbid lobbying, but that's hard. And also things like influence via media is quite difficult to, you can regulate it, but you cannot really contain it completely. And then the fifth reason is that we see that the lifestyles, but also the investment patterns of wealth holders are incompatible with ecological sustainability. It is possible, in theory, that one is very rich and that one has an ecological footprint that is very low. It is possible. But if we look at the data, and I think a striking example is the carbon footprint. We know that we have to get the carbon footprint as close to zero as possible to keep life on Earth for the human species tolerable. We should get that to something like 2 tons per person per year. In Africa, except for the south and the oil countries at the top in the north, the carbon footprint is around 1 ton per person per year. In Europe, on average, it's about 8. In the US, it's about 20. But the carbon footprint of the 1% globally is 101 ton per person per year. This is research by Lucas Chancel that was published either in Nature or Nature Climate Science, one of those journals. And there's also a separate study that tried to estimate for billionaires, the one that we just saw, to the real top of the world. And they have, from their consumption alone, so not looking at their investments, they have carbon footprints up to 8,000 ton per year. And that is, for example, because private air jets or yachts are super polluting. And then the final point, which I and write less about because I'm not a psychologist, is that having large amounts of money also doesn't make people very happy. For some, we've seen that it has a function, an addictive function. Many who have lots of money really feel pressure to keep accumulating more. So one always moves the goalpost, but also wealth can really become a burden. So these are the reasons why I think we would be better off as a society, and it would also be more in line with moral principles if we were to just put a cap on how much personal wealth a person could have. And then we go to the last slide, and that is the question, what should we then do? So as I mentioned, I propose limitarianism, which is a view that we should have an upper limit to how much personal wealth a person can have. It's a regulative ideal. That means I do not believe this will be implemented soon. I do believe we have good reasons to strive to move towards such a world, and keep that in mind as a you could say a dot on the horizon of where we have good reasons to want to go to. The reason why we have increasing wealth inequality and increasing wealth concentration is that we shifted our mixed economies to neoliberal capitalist economies over the last 4 to 5 decades. And I think this is really what we need to change. We can go into what neoliberalism and so on in the Q&A, But it is not just about the policies that have been implemented, but it is also about a set of values and views of ourselves that have changed. So the example that I gave about trying to ignore the role that luck plays and seeing our success as really attributable to ourselves, but also for people who are in poverty, of blaming them for the fact that they're in poverty. The third thing that I think we need to do is to restore our governments in the sense of making them work well, and also reclaim our democracies. They should serve everyone's needs and not just the needs of those who are already the best off, because we have research now that really shows that governments tend to develop pro-rich policies rather than pro-poor policies. The fourth thing I propose is that I think we should change the economic system. I do not argue that we should abolish capitalism in the sense of free market system. Well, free markets actually is already a piece of rhetoric. I would say the market system. We should have an economy that creates sustainable prosperity for all, with lower levels of economic inequalities. And there are all sorts of people currently trying to develop those proposals. So I think that's where the action is. And my analysis supports what they are doing because they also always tend to argue for fewer inequalities. When it comes to concrete policy changes and fiscal policies, I think I endorse what economists who have, I would say, perhaps more moderate positions like Thomas Piketty, Gabriel Zuckman, and others propose. So increasing the progressiveness of taxation, shifting the tax base from labor to capital, all these measures, closing tax havens, super important. All of that I think should be done, but I think we should also simultaneously and complementary think about the ethos. What does this mean for our own decisions? And finally, I think, and this may be perhaps be a bit surprising, but I think it is crucial if one tries to see this in a holistic framework, we should embrace our role as citizens, as activists, and we should really ask the question, what kind of society do we want? And if we answer that question, then I think that the society with limited inequalities will be one of the desiderata. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ingrid. Luke, I'm going to hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Cool. All good. That seems to be working. Thanks, Will. Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Hildyard, and I should also add that in addition to my billing on the flyer that I'm a King's College alumnus, so glad to be back here, albeit in virtual form. I've done some slides. They're not especially visually compelling. It's mainly to act as a crutch in case I digress or lose my train of thought, and it should help everyone understand what I'm banging on about, even if I'm not actually banging on about it. I think that in Limitarianism, Ingrid has articulated and identified a cause that should be the unifying and priority mission of progressive politics from now on. And I hope that a broad and sustained movement is going to rise up behind it. What I wanted to do with my book, which you can see on screen right now, and which I hope will qualify retrospectively as a limitarian text, even though I wasn't entirely aware of that while I was during the writing process, was set out a pragmatic, reasonable, and hopefully readable and good-humoured case for a massive transfer of the income and wealth of the super rich to the wider population. And the argument for that is pretty simple. We should tax the super rich a lot more and get the companies that they run and invest in to redirect more of the money that they currently lavish on executives and wealthy investors to the ordinary workers. And if we did that, general living standards in Britain and globally would be a lot higher, and the economic risks associated with the policies that could achieve this are wildly exaggerated. And I was moved to write it out of frustration at the fact that that the few people making this argument, who in my opinion are the real pragmatists, recognizing that while the economy is not a zero-sum game, distribution does matter, are treated as being extremist or utopian and utterly outside the mainstream. Whereas the kind of comments I've highlighted on the slide here, which are effectively saying, oh, let's solve inequality by making all the poor people as rich as all the rich ones, are seen as the hallmark of serious, sober, and statesman-like policy making. And I'm absolutely not criticizing either of the politicians I've quoted, because I think what they're saying probably lands well with their intended audience. But to me, it is far emptier and far deeper into kind of magic money tree fantasyland territory than the wildest extremes of the Corbyn era. And I say that as someone who's very much agnostic about that whole period. So I've just summarized the book here in one admittedly quite text-heavy slide. First point, the super rich, who I classify as being the richest 1% by income or wealth, just have absolutely loads of money. If you only look to redirect income or wealth beyond the thresholds of the top 1%, you're obviously only affecting a very small number of people, and you're still leaving them with six-figure incomes and millions of pounds worth of assets untouched. In the UK, income at the 99th percentile point is 4 times higher than at the 90th, i.e. the threshold for the richest 10% of the population. And for wealth, someone at the 99th percentile is twice as wealthy as someone at the 90th. So limitarianism, or abolishing the super rich, or whatever terminology you want to use, still leaves people very well rewarded indeed for any success they achieve. And the value of the excess income and wealth beyond the 1% threshold is enormous enough to make a massive difference to wider society if it was used more efficiently. In terms of income, if you reduce the share of total incomes going to the top 1% in the UK from the 17% estimated by a Warwick University study to 7% and spread the difference across the remainder of the population, it'd be worth about £2,500 more per person per year. With wealth, the potential of a more evenly balanced distribution is even more striking. Writing the book, I got down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to work out how much cash you'd need to cover the entire floor space of every home in Britain with £5 notes, and I worked it out at about 1.7 trillion. And the total wealth of the wealthiest 1% of the population is 3.5 trillion. So they could cover the cash value of carpeting every home in the country with fivers from wall to wall across a cost of about £60,000 per property, and still have about 3 million quid left in assets. That's not to say we should all write to our MPs demanding cash carpets for the 99%. There are only £80 billion worth of banknotes in circulation, and frankly, that's only one of the practical issues that the project would run into. The point is that the super rich have theoretically enough wealth to transfer assets worth tens of thousands of pounds to every household in the country and still be left sitting on multi-million-pound fortunes. Obviously, these are hypothetical calculations. If we actually tried to enact the policies that would result in a rebalancing on this scale, might not they be so disastrous that the aggregate pools of income and wealth would shrink? I think it's becoming increasingly untenable to make that argument. The IMF have argued that inequality is bad for economic growth. You've got Nobel Prize-winning economists calling for wealth taxes. It's widely recognised that poorer people have a higher propensity to spend any additional money they get in the productive economy rather than stashing it away. So I think there's a big probability that action to release more of the income and wealth hoarded by the super rich would stimulate economic growth rather than obstructing it. Point 3, would they all leave? Clearly, there is a risk that the super rich would take action to escape policies that would not be to their financial advantage. But I think that risk is greatly overstated. They wouldn't all go. There is no systemic evidence of tax levels having a consistent effect on the location preferences of the super rich. There are steps we can take to mitigate the effect of them going, either unilaterally through exit taxes or in partnership with other countries through a common floor to prevent a race to the bottom, as is already happening on corporation tax. Thirdly, would we miss the super rich that much if they did go? Bankers, CEOs, entrepreneurs, all undoubtedly feel important economic functions, but they aren't born with a godlike gift for those roles. Their capability to fill them comes from education, training, networks, and confidence that they've been imbued with. And if we broaden access to those opportunities, I'm sure there are plenty of people willing to come forward and say, I'd like a prestigious and engaging job for a mere 6-figure pay package. as a bit of an aside, I always think it's strange how passively we accept the pro-super rich argument on this, which is basically that the economy would fall apart without this tiny elite because the rest of us are too stupid or slovenly or drunk to thrive without them. And personally, I take a sort of more positive view of the British and global public than that. Fourth point, if we want people to have faith in a system that rewards people fairly and proportionately for the work that they do and the contribution that they make, we have to take action on the super rich. Evidence of the undeserving rich might include the weak relationship between CEO pay and business performance, the dubious value to society of so many high earners in the financial services sector, where billion-pound fines for unethical behaviour are now almost treated as an inevitable cost of business, or the rich list populated by heirs and heiresses and oligarchs from the former Soviet Union and so on. If you were writing one of those LinkedIn posts of the habits of highly successful people, based on the UK rich list, your top two items would probably be inheriting vast business empires and befriending Vladimir Putin. Even when we're talking about genuine innovators like Jeff Bezos, he's had a good idea for books, selling books online, and then used early adopter status to achieve market domination. Good on him. I'm an Amazon Prime survivor. They're selling my book at a very reasonable price. But that good idea has generated personal wealth greater than that of the total population of entire countries like Croatia and Slovenia. The marker of super rich megalomaniac status used to be owning a private island. We're now at the point where some of them could probably purchase an entire medium-sized European republic. And I think that probably goes beyond what constitutes a proportionate reward for business success. Final point on this slide, my book is about why we should abolish the super rich rather than how to do it. But I think it's worth emphasizing that the policies are out there. Wealth taxes, compulsory profit sharing, CEO to worker pay gaps. These policies already exist in some countries. There's a lot of research on how to implement them successfully. There's no excuse for the timidity. Onto my final slide. This is just some personal thoughts on how I see limitarianism, if that's not extraordinarily pompous. Firstly, I think this agenda is very much associated with taxing the rich, and I think we have to make clear it's about more than that. We need to stop them accumulating such extreme shares of total income and wealth in the first place through mechanisms like worker representation on boards, profit sharing, CEO to worker pay gaps. These measures are more empowering because they don't involve perceived handouts from the super rich. I think that probably makes them more appealing to the public, and they're also harder to undo than wealth taxes and so on. Secondly, I wouldn't see this as necessarily a degrowth agenda, but certainly at a time when environmental and demographic challenges are making growth harder to achieve, a more even distribution is going to help us raise living standards for the people whose standard of living most urgently needs to be raised. In any case, in the UK, the poorest 50% of the population by income get less than 20p of every £1 made. So in order for growth to have much of an impact on living standards, we need to stop so much of the proceeds of growth going to the super rich. Thirdly, I just don't think this is that left wing. We need to tax the rich in order to fund the police and the courts and the armed forces just as much as the NHS and the welfare state. When I think about my own political beliefs, I was delighted 2 years ago when my daughter was born that I was finally able to join the ranks of the much vituperated centrist dads. Personally, I think the NHS probably does need a bit of reform as well as more money. I think we need to manage migration. I think the flag on the England football kit looks faintly ridiculous, although I wouldn't say that it keeps me awake at night. But I also think that we should eradicate billionaires and that workers' councils should expropriate shareholders' wealth. And I think that Mondeo Man and Worcester Woman and whatever their modern equivalents might be can be persuaded that that's reasonable. Surely, if you're any kind of pragmatist on the centre or centre-right who just wants to make society a bit better, you have to be at least a bit curious about the feasibility of using the vast pool of income and wealth of the super rich to do that. I think some people have reflexively talk themselves into a daftly hostile position on this agenda because they don't like the people who advocate for it. And those of us who do believe in it have to do our bit to help moderates to get there by not talking about it in adversarial or extreme language or holding past policy heresies against them. Finally, I highlighted those quotes from Rachel Reeves and Kemi Badenoch in the first slide. And to reiterate, I didn't want to criticise either of them for making those comments. I think they reflect the fact that voters actually and unfortunately find attacks on the rich quite alienating. And there's lots of evidence to show that, which I discuss in the book. Indeed, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to make a reasoned case that the super rich do represent a problem and that it isn't really that extreme to want to do something about it. The public isn't there yet, and I think it is going to take a while to get them there. What I would note is that the response that people who focus on the super rich often get from the mainstream, why are you banging on about this fringe issue? Nobody minds if if rich people are getting rich. Reminds me a lot of the way that people used to deride the oddballs and fruitcakes who wanted to take Britain out of the European Union, and look at where we are now on that. Certainly, whatever you think about Brexit, there's no shortage of lessons to learn from it, and there's another one. We must and will keep banging on about this, abolishing the super rich, limitarianism, but I'm going to stop doing so now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luke. Graham, over to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Will. I've met Ingrid before many times and know her well, and was very much looking forward to reading her book. For context, I'm somebody who has wealth from an entrepreneurial business creation background, and I'm a member of an organization called Patriotic Millionaires, where we campaign to reduce inequality and to campaign for more progressive taxation. So I'm somewhat of a turkey voting for Christmas, but I can talk as somebody who is the target of much of the change that this book is proposing. So I came to reading the book with a fair amount of empathy for the concepts. I wasn't expecting to find so much of it so challenging, and Ingrid knows that I found a lot of it challenging, and I'm going to just talk about that. I mean, first of all, the core concepts of her book about the damaging effects of inequality are clear. We've already heard from her. It's undermining democracy, it's setting the world on fire, and the poor are getting poorer. She came up with this idea, as she said, of a moral limit above which each citizen has a responsibility to think about how they can use their wealth to help society, and then a political upper limit where she considers that the state might intervene and start to limit that wealth. Those numbers in her book are generally 1 million pounds or euros or dollars for the lower level, and 10 million for the upper level. And I think when you read those, it's easy to get hung up on those numbers and say, well, 10 million pounds is, or 10 million euros is a lot of money in the Netherlands. It's perhaps a little bit less in terms of cost of living in the UK, and considerably less in the US. But as I was reading, I understood her arguments that these are arbitrary levels she set to progress her arguments, and in each country could have an opinion about what they should actually be. So then on to some of the more provocative arguments that she has. Nobody deserves to be a millionaire. The hint of confiscation above the 10 million level is quite shocking to read. A quote, having more than 1 million pounds does not meaningfully enhance your quality of life. And as a London resident, I disagree with that. Almost all fortunes are based in part or in whole on dirty money. And I understand completely what she's saying, but disagree. I think capitalism in its purest form can deliver wealth without any of the criminal or societally corrupt causes. She has incredibly strong views on neoliberalism, which I understand. But also, I think Ingrid would accept herself, she's quite lukewarm on capitalism. And as an entrepreneur, I found that tricky to deal with. But the shock values worked, and the book ultimately reset my frame of reference and made me more open to think about the purpose of society and fairness and social mobility more generally. It's not a book about despair or acceptance of where we are now. It goes into quite a lot of detail about the benefits of creating a fairer society, and that's a vision that we share at Patriotic Millionaires. She has many suggestions for next steps and implementation, some of which were very creative, and I enjoyed reading those. And her book outlines how the rich will benefit too. And speaking from my own perspective, I have children. I have 3 adult sons, and I want them to live in a vibrant society with good opportunity for all, high social mobility, that's safe and fair, and they don't want to feel like there may be pitchforks coming for them, or to have to live in a gated community. And I think there are many challenges to having wealth, and it really stems from how much unfairness we see around us. So I found the book challenging but thought-provoking. It changed my perspective on the goals. At Patriotic Millionaires, we are focused on inequality, but mostly on campaigning for a wealth tax, a 1 or 2% annual wealth tax. And I saw a newsletter this morning with the headline, it's easy to solve these problems, tax the rich. And now I realize from reading Ingrid's book that it's not that simple. We can't just take money away from the richest and give it to the poorest. We have to understand the mechanisms that are baked in to our tax system and into our societal rules and our laws that are extracting wealth away from the working families and into the hands of the wealthy who are buying assets. And until we structurally change those rules, this is going to keep happening. We could keep clawing money back through wealth taxes, but it's not in itself the end goal. So I grew up in an age of much higher social mobility in the UK. I was not a good student at school, but I managed to get a grant to have a free university education. And that completely changed me as a person. I didn't cop on for the first 18 months or so, but eventually figured out what it was all about, got a degree, had a good career, and eventually was able to start a successful business. And I'm not sure I would have had the same path and success today if I had to make a choice to go and pay $9,000 a year. I want those same opportunities for my family, their children eventually, and for others around me. And I think our climate challenges are clearly made worse by inequality. And Ingrid's book is giving us a route to solve some of these things. I saw in the Q&A somebody, I know we're getting short on time, but I saw David mentioned Gary Stevenson, who's another member of Patriotic Millionaires and has a book out at the moment called The Trading Game. And I met Gary a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about some of these arguments, and he said something to me which really resonated, and I want to paraphrase it here. He said, people are being lied to by politicians in the UK. They're being told they're poor because of many reasons, including immigration, the EU, high taxes, COVID, various conflicts around the world. And this is not true. The real reason they are poor is because of inequality. So Ingrid's book shows us this and how to fix it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Graham. Looking at the Q&A that's come in so far, it feels to me that there are sort of 3 broad arguments, objections to the arguments, or questions about the arguments, and in 3 buckets: philosophical, political, and economic. So I wonder if we can take each of those in turn and ask perhaps Ingrid to answer first, and then Luke and Graham if they have anything to add. So Ingrid, on the philosophical side first, what have been the main philosophical arguments against limitarianism? And one of the examples alluded to in the questions is around the John Rawls difference principle. You know, this idea that inequality is not unfair as long as it's to the benefit of the worst off. Is that an example of, you know, how do you see that sitting alongside or being contradicted by limitarianism? And what are the other philosophical arguments that you've encountered?
Yes, this is a great question because it helps me to clarify something. So, Rawls' principle and much of the philosophical literature is about opportunities. So, and it's also ideal theory, which is assuming everybody is motivated by a sense of justice and so on and so forth. So we're basically all good citizens. Limitarianism is really a philosophical view, also quite interdisciplinary for the world as it is, and it focuses on outcomes, not on on a principle in terms of opportunities. I think the Rawlsian difference principle would translate in the world as we have into something either very close to limitarianism or limitarianism. And there's actually two philosophers who've written papers on this. One is Chris Neuhauser in a book that I edited that can be found online called Having Too Much. He argues that the Rawlsian difference principle should be understood as entailing limitarianism. And Lisa Herzog has a paper forthcoming in another book that will take another year before that's out, where she's arguing that the fact that there's this status element in consumption and in that actually gives us reasons why we should endorse limitarianism, and that this is also because Rawls is not just about the difference principle is actually the third principle. First, there is equal value of basic liberties, which is undermined by which limitarianism points out wealth concentration undermines political equality, and the other one is equality of opportunity. We don't have either of those. So I actually think, although Rawls is abstract, limitarianism and Rawls are very close.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. Graham, Luke, anything to add before we move on to the political questions?
Not really. There were a couple of other questions that I had some sort of thoughts on, so maybe move on, Will.
Okay, great. On the political side, so a couple of questions, I suppose, that for me reflects some of the Q&A points more generally. So one is, isn't it a bit of a cop-out to talk about going after the super rich? Because that always sounds like going after somebody else. And linked to that, how can we challenge the tacit acceptance of the status quo? So, you know, both how can we make this a more sort of inclusive message, but also almost a more edgy message in terms of trying to get around some of today's fatalism. Ingrid, you want to start, and then we'll move on to Luke and Graham.
Yes, I'll try to be brief so that the other speakers also have time to reflect, to share their views. So I think it is true that it is that we shouldn't just focus on the very rich. Actually, I think, although I am not beyond this richest line, I'm also having a very privileged life. So I should also ask, what are my duties towards the worst off in society? But I do, in the part of the book where I talk about the meeting unmet needs and so forth, there are questions for all of us. And especially if one embraces this view of the enormous influence of luck on our lives, then actually many of us, just already by being born in Europe rather than being born in Afghanistan or Madagascar, we should really be counting our blessings. And if you take that perspective as a human being, it really also, I think, changes how you respond to others in need.
Thank you. Luke?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Luke.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry. These were the questions I thought were most interesting, because I actually disagree a little bit with Carol and Rosalind, and I'll try and set out some evidence why. I think we do absolutely need to focus on the super rich. And I think one of the challenges of doing that is that it doesn't sound like you're going after somebody else. When people hear about there's some focus groups on attitudes to a wealth tax that were absolutely fascinating, with sort of swing voters around the country. And they revealed quite interesting levels of hostility to the idea of taxes on the rich. And then we got into the discussion of who do you actually think is rich? And their definition is, oh, you know, somebody who gets to the end of the month and they've still got a bit of money left over for little luxuries, or somebody who can just buy a round of drinks in the bar and not have to worry about the cost of it. Interestingly, that's what people hear when you're talking about taxing the rich, not the sort of people who are actually aiming to tax more, people who you could tax a lot more, or, you know, stop them accumulating quite so much money in the first place, and they're still going to be very, very comfortably off. So I think it's really important to emphasize there is this very small elite of people who have such sort of concentrations of income and wealth that if you release that, it would make an enormous difference to other people's lives, and it wouldn't have that much impact on their own standard of living, because even after, you know, paying their workers more or paying more tax, they'd still be incredibly rich. And I think that's a really important point that we need to sort of hammer home in order for this agenda to make any progress.
Thanks, Luke. Graham.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is okay to go after the very wealthiest to get more cash that the country needs. As Ingrid said earlier, we can afford to pay 1-2%, possibly more of our wealth and not see any loss of lifestyle, and that's not true for the lowest earning in society. And you know, the rules that we followed over the last few years have meant that there's very high degrees of concentration of wealth at the top, and that needs to be slowly reversed. And we've had, you know, close to 15 years of zero interest rates where the wealthiest have managed to increase their asset base and own those assets and then charge rent on them. So it's really swung so much towards the wealthiest. Sorry, what was the second part of your question, Will? The political question.
How can we challenge the sort of the fatalism, the tacit acceptance of the status quo?
Oh yes, and you also asked about public views on charging more and funding public services more. Yeah, there was a poll recently that found that the public, including conservative voters, were very much in favor of higher funding for public services, and if that meant higher taxation, they would accept it. 74% of conservative voters support an increase in corporation tax. 45% of conservative voters rejected tax cuts if they resulted in cuts to public services. So the public really are in favor of this when they're given a reasoned argument about it. So I think the will is there. We just want to find brave politicians with a long-term view for society that are willing to enact some of these changes. Great,
thanks, Graham. And a final question to all three of you, starting again with Ingrid, is on some of the economic objections to limitarianism. So how do you argue against the suggestion that it might undermine innovation, initiative, entrepreneurship, investment, and ultimately affect economic growth?
Yeah, so I think if one were to advocate for a planned economy, I can see how this would be the case. So so the only reason why how this argument, which I think really is often more a piece of rhetoric than a solid piece of scientifically based argument, is if the economic growth that we have depends on people who are investing their own, because I'm talking about personal wealth, their own money, and would no longer be doing this if they couldn't have more than a total wealth of 10 million. The question is, where does innovation really come from? It's not just from this small group of people who fall into this category. It's also from, I mean, it could be also, of course, from say, an entrepreneurial state like Mazzucato argues, if we were to enable the government to do that. But it could also be from different forms of cooperation, which is what actually people working on corporations are now increasingly arguing are the models for the future. And I think what we should not forget is that we now have a huge untapped potential, because poor people, and that's basically, as we've seen from the figures, half of the people have no wealth. They're stunned in their economic potential because they can't get the training they need. They can't have the proper, even something like proper nutrition. They can't have the same safe households. So I would I think we need to compare full worlds and not just one effect. And I want to make one last point in response to this argument, because it is a kind of stubborn one that you always feel. The point of the economy is not, it's not the economy. The economy is not a goal in itself. The economy is the means for us to have good lives. So the question should be, what does it mean for us to have good lives? And I think something like the issues that Graham and Luke were already mentioning, like having a safe society, having a society that feels fair, having also kind of good relationships between people in society, knowing that there will be some security in case things go wrong. I mean, people care a lot about security. Those things make life good. And so innovation should not be seen as a kind of a Trump value that, and enhance economic growth as a Trump value that can be used as an argument to challenge anybody who wants to argue for a different type of socioeconomic system which focuses on human well-being. We should start from human well-being and then reason what kind of economy do we need.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. Luke, I can give you 1 minute.
I'd just say, how have we achieved progress in the past? This is the way it's always been. If you think, trade unions ensuring the wealth of the Industrial Revolution was shared equally, welfare state and the NHS through progressive taxation after World War II, the minimum wage, which turned 25 yesterday, all these things were supposed to ruin the economy. They never did. Ultimately, sort of living standards are about how much wealth we have and how that wealth is distributed. Redistributing or predistributing incomes and wealth is what we've always done to raise living standards. It's the rational and pragmatic thing to do based on evidence and experience.
Thanks, Luke. Graham.
Well, history tells us that no civilization or society has ended well when we've got out of control inequality and a rising elite dominating everything. It all ends very badly for everybody. But we should focus more on the positive, which is this huge opportunity in allowing people to participate more in society, have more social mobility, to discover their latent talents, to contribute to innovation, growth, productivity, and all the benefits of living in a vibrant society. So I think we should jump all in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Graham. Well, it's time to wrap up now. Thank you for all your questions, and thank you for coming today. And thanks in particular to Ingrid, to Luke, and to Graham for their fantastic contributions to this discussion, as well as to Bobby Duffy and Sophia and George and colleagues at King's College London. The next event in this series is in person with Will Hutton and discussants on the 22nd of April in the evening at Bush House in central London on his new book, This Time No Mistakes, and details will be published and circulated shortly by email and on our website and on the King's College website. And we're also planning events later this year with Elizabeth Anderson, Torsten Bell, and Danny Dorling. Thank you again. Goodbye.